This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Zia and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode thanks to our Dig Me Out Union on Patreon. You can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And we are back again with another tournament episode. This is our, I guess, September winner of the albums submitted. Is that correct?
This would be October.
No, wasn't the October one the one that just finished?
Oh, you're right. Sorry. September.
That's okay. Yeah, we got to we can't forget September. And even though
we love you, September.
Even though it's the beginning of the school year, well, not anymore. It's like August now. It's the beginning of the school year. I used to hate September when I was a kid because that's when you had to go back to school.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I was a C student. And we are back with, as mentioned, a tournament episode. 9 albums entered. Only 1 album survived this tournament. So let's go through what the suggestions were through digmeoutpodcast.com. That's where you go to suggest an album, both for this 90s rock podcast and our 80s metal podcast. Here we go. Eric Peterson suggested Pandemonium by Killing Joke. Vadim Taver suggested Show World by Red Cross. Darren Leach suggested Perverse by Jesus Jones. Justin Moore suggested Kantiki by Cotton Mather.
Kantiki.
Wout Velmanik. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. I'm not even close. Suggested This Beautiful Mess by Sixpence None the Richer. Speaking of, they just put out an EP like 2 weeks ago.
Yep.
Willie Dillon
You subscribe to our newsletter, you know that.
That's true. Willie Dillon suggested Keysby Nights by Catch 22. Michael Dussing suggested Shakespeare My Butt by Lowest of the Low. Chip suggested Doing the Nasty by Slick Toxic. Lots of misspellings there.
A lot of K's.
Yeah. And Keith Badge suggested The Last Dog and Pony Show by Bob Mold. Here's how the poll shook out. Now, going into this, I thought this was a really good poll because you had stuff that's like not super popular, but I know a lot of these names. Like I knew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these, and then 3 of them were unfamiliar. And the voting was kind of spread out. Didn't know who was going to win until kind of sort of towards the end. First place.
I was feeling Killing Joke was going to pull this one out. So,
and I feel like we do need to get to a Killing Joke album at some point. They are a pretty relevant band to our discussion, as well as I know we've talked about Sugar, but Bob Mold has a pretty significant solo career that is different than Sugar. But the winner, with 25% of the vote, Jesus Jones and their 1993 album Perverse. Red Cross and Killing Joke tied for second place, followed by Bob Mold, and then the rest were way far behind. Yep. So let me ask you, Jay. I know you know this song Right Here, Right Now.
Yep.
Everybody knows that song from like 1991 or whatever it was. Had you actually listened to an entire Jesus Jones album?
Nope. I only knew this. I guess that one single. They didn't have any other singles.
Well, they did. Off of their first album came out in '89, Liquidizer. Doubt, which is the one that we know from the singles, came out in '91. That actually had 3 singles. The first single was Real, Real, Real. Second single, Right Here, Right Now, that came out in September of 1990. And then The third single was International Bright Young Thing, came out in December of 1990. Now, this band for me appears on what I like to call my Fiero Jams playlist, which when I was in high school, I worked at a grocery store, and one of the guys at the grocery store drove a red Pontiac Fiero
Yes.
and had a lot of singles. And those singles of like 1990, 91 consisted of Jesus Jones, the Snoop Dragons, the Soup Dragons, EMF, uh, Big Audio Dynamite, In Excess. There was some hip hop in there with like Black Sheep and Third Bass, and it was just a lot of stuff that was on the radio and a lot of dancey stuff, a lot of beat driven music. That's what he was into. So that's when we would go to Burger King on our lunch. That's where we would pop in a new single that he had and listen to it in his 1990 Fiero, which was a pretty sick car for the time. I don't think
That's one of those. I'm surprised there's not like there's a whole niche around bringing back DeLoreans and people restoring them and like new companies making them and like it's kind of lived on. I'm shocked that there's not a Fiero. Maybe there is. I just haven't seen it, but like a Fiero mini movement,
community,
because those would probably be killer for converting to electric because they were so small and the engines in them sucked anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I want to retire with an electric Fiero.
So here's what Darren Leach said. The forgotten third album by the UK band. Grunge made the world forget about this electronic rock genre. I'd say that's kind of true, especially in all the bands that I mentioned did not have albums that broke through past 1991, thanks to Nirvana. Nobody was listening to the Soup Dragons in 1993 that I'm aware of. But I mean, obviously some people were, but it wasn't a mainstream thing like in 1991. So about this album, this was released January of 1993. It was produced by Warren Livesey, who produced a lot of. He's a British Canadian guy. He produced like Midnight Oil, the Matthew Good Band, just to name a few. The band should give you some history of Jesus Jones.
History of the band.
The band has pretty much stayed together. They've had one change in the lineup, but for the most part, it has been Mike Edwards on vocals, guitars, and keyboards since the beginning. Jerry DeBorg on guitars since the beginning. Al Daughtry on bass since the beginning. Ian Baker on keyboards and programming. And then the original drummer is named Simon Edward Robert Matthews. He goes by Gen, Gen. And he was in the band from the beginning until 1999. And then he dropped out, and Tony Arthy took over from 1999 to 2013. And then in 2014, Jen returned. And so they've had essentially the same lineup, and they just put out a new single like this week. They haven't had an album out since 2018. And that was, so we'll get into the releases here. So their first album comes out, Liquidizer, in October of 1989. That went silver in the UK. Doubt, the big breakthrough, January of 1991. That went gold in the UK, platinum in Canada, platinum in New Zealand, platinum in the United States. Followed by the album we're going to talk about, Perverse, came out in 1993. This actually did chart across the world, just not really high. The highest was in the UK, made it number 6 in the UK. Everywhere else, it's like top 30, top 50. 4-year break, and they returned with Already in 1997. In 2001, they released London. Then there was a 17-year break, and they released Passages in 2018. Every one of their album titles is a single word, which is interesting. Trying to think if there's another band that's ever done that, like where they follow a pattern for their album titles, but I don't know. I can't think of one off the top of my head. So as mentioned, like right here, right now, that went to number 1 on the US alternative chart and number 2 on the overall Billboard chart. And it actually did better here than in like the UK. It only made it to number 31 in the UK. Made it to number 18 in Canada. So it was the US that really pushed that single for the band. And then off Perverse, The Devil You Know made its number 1 on the US alternative chart. That's it though. It didn't chart on the Billboard 200.
Okay.
So, but they got some airplay off of that single, and then they had a couple other singles that charted in other parts of the world, but not here in the US. That's pretty much it. They have they've been together, and I mean there was that long break, but they've continued. They never broke up. There's no like years active with a break in there. They've just been together since 1988, and that's kind of unusual that you've basically had the same 5 guys for what is that, 36 years. That's pretty
very unusual.
Yeah, very unusual. So let's get into some of the comments from this poll, see what people had to say, see if anybody actually talked about the album that won, because it's usually not the case. Jeremy Amen said that Jesus Jones album is such an outlier and deserves to be dug out, as do many of the albums in this poll. I remember reading an interview with Mike Edwards after The Devil You Know released, but before the album released. The idea of a fully synthetic and entirely digital rock album was intriguing, but also worried me, as I liked his guitar work on previous efforts. If nothing else, it's a piece of history that hardly anyone seemed to appreciate then or now. So I'm going to talk about what he's talking about in just a minute, in case you don't know the making of this record.
Okay.
Kyle Bittner said, tough grouping this time around. Bob Mould, Slick Toxic, Lowest of the Low, and Red Cross. I listened to that Slick album a ton in high school, and I saw them with Sven Gali, Ugly Kid Joe, Rockhead, April Wine, and Def Leppard. That's a lineup. I hadn't listened to it in decades, but went on a bit of a kick recently, so Slick Toxic gets my vote. I guess was there a miss? Was one of the albums mistakenly? Oh yeah, Keith Miller said the Catch-22 album is actually called Keysby Nights, not just Nights. Got it. All right. Scott Hallgrim said that Bob Mould album is so good top to bottom, greatly underrated. Eric Norlander said Red Cross for sure, while Third Eye remains their greatest album. Show World, the second of their only 2 albums in the 90s, goes hard. Joe Royland said got to go with Red Cross on this one. Justin Moore said voting Cotton Mather. It was my choice. Richard Waterman said my favorite Red Cross album gets the vote. Keith Miller did go with Catch-22. Jeff Genta said that Mold album has one of my favorite songs, period, but the rest didn't click for me for a quarter century. The rest didn't click for me a quarter century ago. I ranked it second from the group. Chip Midnight said one of these things is not like the other. Slick Toxic would make way more sense in an 80s metal poll, as they were Canada's version of Skid Row. Ian McIver, Killing Joke, no contest. I do want to mention that it said Killing Joe in the poll, not Killing Joke.
Copy paste here. Sorry.
That's okay.
That's how it was submitted.
Whitney Bueller voted for Red Cross. Those are all the comments. So let me give you the explanation on the digital aspect of this record. So Mike Edwards, their first couple albums, they have a dance structure to it. And he was listening to like rave and techno music as well as rock music when he was making those records. And he decided he wanted to like move into a digital recording setup. So they literally recorded this whole album on floppy disks. It's all computer.
I mean, so it's not just digital. It's what? Why with the floppy disk? What is that about?
It was all done on a Roland W3 sampler, and there, I guess there was a disc that you would put in.
Wow. Okay.
And so he pretty much wrote so that they on previous albums, the previous two albums, like the band like would get a demo idea of what he wanted, and then they would play it. And in this one, he pretty much wrote all of the music and the lyrics himself. And then they figured out how to play it live later.
Huh. Okay.
So this is, according to Edwards, it's the second album in the 90s to be completely recorded on computer. The first one is an album called TV Sky by the Young Gods. I have not heard that record. It came out in 1992, the previous year to this. But apparently when they were telling people like, yeah, we're recording this whole record on computer, people were like, you're crazy. How can you make a record on a computer?
I mean, 93, that's,
still pretty early.
Right there on the edge. But yeah, I could see.
Yeah.
I'm more, well, we'll talk about more as we get into it. I guess I'm more surprised that so much was done on a sequencer.
Yeah. He used multiple ones. He used the Roland JD 800. But he said, like, so this is his quote. He turned every song into binary codes and then fiddled with them until he had achieved suitably high-tech noise. The whole album only exists in frequencies. Jerry DeBorg's guitar is presented at 300 hertz to 8 kilohertz. The Roland GR50 guitar synth was used to load the album's guitar parts into the computer. Al Jaworski's bass, meanwhile, became 20 hertz to 4 kilohertz and such. There was no such thing as bass on the record. So it's all built on frequencies on the keyboard, essentially.
I mean, that's how all music works, but okay.
Right. Well, it sounded profound when he said it.
Yeah, I'm like,
in 1993.
What you're describing is how music works. It's
right.
All frequencies.
Honestly, like frequency, yes. You're
and you mix when you mix a record, you figure out what frequencies you want, what instruments to occupy.
Right.
Okay.
So I guess he's saying that because they didn't actually like play a bass guitar. It was all like he would pick a sound and then warp it into that frequency to get the bass tone he wanted. I don't know.
Okay.
It's interesting, if not entirely clear.
Yeah.
So yeah, this. Let's see. There was a deluxe edition that was released with multiple CDs and a DVD and all that kind of stuff in like 2014. If you want to pick that sort of thing, pick it up. And we should get into the record. Let's talk about Perverse by Jesus Jones. Jay, tell me what worked for you on this record.
Well, I'm a bit puzzled based on what you're telling me about how it's recorded, because it sounds very performed to me. It is probably one of the most energetic, live feeling electronic or digital albums I've ever heard in my life. They're doing things with synth and guitars. I mean, to the point where you don't know which is which sometimes. or I guess it, based on what you're talking about, how it's recorded, I guess it doesn't matter. But they're doing things with these sounds that I've never heard somebody do, playing those instruments just using like keys. That makes sense. It's like the parts sound more like guitar riffs, like they're being strummed sometimes or arpeggiated with fingers on a guitar versus hands on a keyboard. And if you've tried to play either of those two things, you know, like, oh, it's really hard to play an AC/DC riff on a piano. Like,
well,
it
he did say they used
right.
a synth guitar.
Okay. So like the way that they're constructing all of this is creating a really distinct and exciting sound for digital music for sure. Like, bass lines sound like somebody playing bass. I'm assuming they don't sound like somebody on a keyboard, but it all has this tone and kind of chaotic energy to it that is distinctly digital. So it sounds, I don't know if it would have stood out so much at the time, but it certainly does now. You know, in interesting ways, in that you buy it as rock music, but it's not guitar based rock music, or not in the way that you would traditionally think. It's rock music because of the energy, the tempos, the style of riffs, or the way the parts are played, these driving bass lines that can also morph into grooves. And then within those pieces and parts and those sounds that are very unique, I think you listen to it now, you can kind of hear how, where we ended up at the end of the 90s, and a lot of bands that were doing digital music almost sound like they took parts of these ideas, like, and went completely in that direction. Like, this band is putting all of these different sounds of electronic music into one thing and presenting it kind of like a rock album. And what was successful more in the 90s was like more niche stuff of like, okay, we're just an industrial band. We're just going to take these elements of the sounds and just go, you know, really in that extreme direction. Or we're going to do like trance, or we're going to do whatever, electronica, or whatever subgenre of electronic music. Very few people put it together in this way, which is really interesting, because this is, I think, going back to the album before this, it really felt like, oh, this is where music's going to go in the 90s. And to me, the sound of this doubles down on that. It's like, oh yeah, in a lot of ways, this is what you would have thought rock music would have turned into commercially across the board, but it doesn't. It obviously fractures. And this is not the way that sort of most bands present music. So it's a really exciting sound. It holds up in a weird way, even though when you break down the tones, you know, some of these tones, some of these drum sounds and stuff, you're like, oh my God, that sounds like a early 90s R&B song, you know, that snare sound or whatever. But when they put it all together, there's just an energy to it. It feels vital and performed. It has a nice balance of melody and darkness, to the point where it sounds almost timeless in a weird way. So yeah, it's a distinct sounding record concept, and really well executed for what it is. I think you know, it's melodic. It's got pop songs, but it also has some experimentation and a lot of dynamics. So it's an exciting record to listen to. You're not just like stuck in one grind. You're moving around a lot. You got some big choruses. You've got stuff that, like Spiral, gets a little crazy and off the rails. you got stuff that's big and epic sounding, like Idiot Steve. You get a lot of range. Oh, Stare. That you would want in a rock album, in a big rock album, but it doesn't sound like a traditional rock album. So I think that's what I think worked best. It was surprising. What worked for you?
This was a wild one because I didn't know what to expect. And when it opened, I thought, am I listening to U2's pop album? Because their attempt at doing a dance record in the vein of, rave club music it sounds like this, but 4 years later. And it makes me go, I wonder if U2 were inspired by this record, because there are tones, buzzy synth sounds that sound like they're straight off of like this. The lead single Discotheque has sounds that sound exactly like what's on here, which made me realize like, oh, Jesus Jones wrote, they weren't just a single, one hit. They're known for one hit, but like this is a legitimately interesting record that's totally out of left field for this period. And like you said, it's very stamped, but also weirdly timeless because of the fact that it's electronic. Yeah. Like if somebody made this record now, it would sound like they're making an electronic album.
Yeah.
I'm sure some things would be a little bit different, but for the most part, it is very energetic. I think there's maybe like 2 songs that are on the slow end of things, but everything's got a propulsion to it, and everything's got energy to it. And there's lots of little interesting things happening on a number of the tracks, like The Devil You Know, which was the single. It opens and it sort of has this like Eastern sounding percussion thing happening.
Yep.
But then you get like these big guitar stabs where they sound like, I guess they're synth guitar stabs. I just felt like when I was listening to this, like I listened to a couple times to try to, I got into it. But the first couple times I didn't really know what to expect. Like everything felt very fresh, even though I've heard these sounds before.
Yeah.
I don't know how to explain it better than that.
Mm-hmm. It's what I was saying with some of those drum sounds where you're like, oh, that's a bad snare. But then the song starts, like the full span comes in. You're like, oh no, that's super cool. The individual sounds, I'm like, that's awful. But when they come together, it's like, oh, that totally works.
And then a lot of the songs are up tempo, but then you get a song like Yellow Brown, which is a very atmospheric, kind of dark sounding song, and it sounds like industrial in the way that like an industrial band would do, like one of those dark, ominous, slow songs.
Yep.
Like we just talked about with Pig, and one of the songs off of that record, or like what Nine Inch Nails would do. It just had this atmospheric cinematic vibe that was just unexpected. And then if you follow that, you get Magazine, which is a very catchy, like 2-minute and 45-second song. But again, it's got that like and like this is like this is techno club music. It's crazy, but it's in the context of a rock band, which is just it's just a weird combo. And I understand like why people would have been wanting us to check it out, because it just doesn't sound like anything, especially for 1993. It just sounds so ahead of its time for that period. And Mike Edwards said he was trying to bring all of these sounds he was hearing in the underground and make them palatable to a rock audience. I don't know that, like, if you were listening to, if you were into Jesus Jones, like let's say you bought Doubt because of Right Here Right Now, maybe you got like the other singles, even that song seems a lot more tame
Yeah.
compared to what is happening on here, even though they were technically like a dance band. There's a term for it in the UK. It's called grebo, but it's like alternative. It's like when you take like dance music but combine it with alternative rock. um I guess Ned's Atomic Dustbin is considered a grebo band, and Carter USM, who we've talked about, we did way way long ago. So you're taking like these electronic, you know, dance elements, a little bit of psychedelic sounds, and then combining them with basically being played by rock bands. This to me is just like this is not that. This is just a techno rock album, which is a weird thing to say. But it definitely did. It caught me way off guard, knowing what I knew about one song. So
Yeah. It's it's so you mentioned dance a lot. I can obviously hear that, but for whatever reason, it didn't read as a dance ish record to me. It's danceable, obviously, but like the way they put it together, I think because the drums are just much more active than what you would hear, or I would consider like a straight dance out, track. The tempos are a little different. Like they're a little too fast or a little too slow for straight dance music. So it ends up like just skewing enough for me that I guess what they were trying to do, right? Make it palatable for somebody like me who's more of a rock fan. Um, which I think it does really well. It avoids a lot of the trappings that I usually get annoyed with digital music. We're short, repetitive loops, or like letting the automation of the instruments kind of take over. Which is one of my pet peeves about listening to a lot of electronic music. It's like, oh, I can tell you just hit a button and you like the way that sound, and you just let that play for 2 bars.
Right.
Versus performing every note. This sounds like every note is being performed.
Yeah.
Some of that might have to do with like what I read as effects. I don't know how they're doing it, but a lot of this stuff sounds like they're running it through delays and extra distortion and arpeggiators and like I don't know what's going on, but to my ears, that's what it sounds to me. It sounds like they're taking a bunch of synths and synth guitar and running it through a bunch of stomp boxes that create these crazy sounds and then recording them. I don't know if that's what they're doing, but to my ears, that's how I read it, which again, along with how they're arranged and sequenced and performed, brings life to everything, kind of creates this unexpected, like tones and things come in and out and they move in ways that are less predictable and gives it life.
Yeah. He did say that there are some like samples. I don't know if it's samples of like them playing or sample where he was getting the samples, but he would just find a musical phrase or something that he liked and then just affect the shit out of it essentially and completely make it unrecognizable and layer things, layer effects, layer sounds, so that he was building these like parts out of samples and out of playing on the Rolands. I don't know what the capability of the Rolands is. I mean, looking at the Roland JD 800, There's a lot of switches on that thing. I'm guessing there's a built-in arpeggiator on that. I'm guessing
Yeah,
there's a lot of effects built into that particular keyboard.
I've played with a lot of instruments. I don't know anything about samplers or
Right.
sequencers. Sorry.
So, because so for the example, like when they did the credits, the drummer got credit for drum type sounds, not for actual drums. So he did play some stuff, but it was I don't know if it was just, and that's the case where like you can hit, a piece of wood with a stick, and then if you sample it and manipulate it and pitch it up, pitch it down, you can create all sorts of new sounds out of it. And all you're doing is hit a piece of wood with a stick. But
Yeah.
that's a lot of work.
I mean, a lot of these drum sounds to me sound like fairly typical drum samples from the early 90s.
Yeah.
It's the synths that are and the guitars and whatever's going on around it that are not.
Yeah. And moving into what didn't work, um, some of that rhythm stuff, like I kept hearing that Republica song, Ready to
Yeah.
Go. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Because that basically, like, that style
Yeah.
has its own genre of, and I don't know, I'm guessing a lot of people are using the same keyboards because obviously they're popular keyboards and people buy them.
Yep.
You're going to use the same drum patterns. It's just inevitable if you're pulling the drum beats from. Now obviously the tempos matter, how you layer things matter, but I did feel like, at least from a rhythm standpoint, I wasn't as engaged as like hearing all the weird noises with keyboard stuff and synth guitar and his vocal too. I mean, there's quite a few songs where there's like layered vocals where there's multiple vocal tracks happening, and he's not just singing like one part. But at a certain point, it did start to feel a little samey. I don't know if that happened with you, where I felt like, where am I in this record? I know I'm in the back half, but
Yep. Yeah, I think for me it was that as I dug deeper and tried to figure out what was going on there, my biggest note was it's just overly dense sometimes. There's too much going on. In particular, there's a lot of like shaker hi-hat things. Um, there's a lot of panning too, like hard panning and instruments coming in and out. And then when you combine those elements and all the layering of the synths we talked about with a vocal that almost sounds like a synth, like he sings in this very like, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like a hushed tone. Like he sings full throated at times and singing quite loud, but there's like the top end of his voice is cut off. I mean, it sound, if you know the single, you know what he sounds like. It's a really unique. I mean, the closest I could get to like what he sounds like when he sings, it's almost like this super processed Def Leppard stuff. Where everybody's like, you know what I mean, singing in that weird like, like breathy kind of tone, but the whole record's like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that presents a problem in that like you get these overly dense sections with a vocal like that. It's not able to cut through all the time. So it almost just becomes like another layer of synth. And I found myself, that is the parts of the record where I started to fade, lose focus, was like these heavy, dense sections that don't have a big hook or don't, if they do, the vocal is buried or not able to cut through enough to pay it off. So I think that's what didn't work and probably what I struggle with in and out of the record. It's not like, it's actually like kind of an up and down. If I look at my sort of my notes of the tracks that work and don't, It's
Mhm.
not like the first half worked and the second half didn't, or it's kind of like these two songs, then I fade, then this song worked, then I fade, then this song worked, then I fade. Um, so yeah, it's a songs that are overly dense in the same kind of like tempo range, delivery. When they shake things up with yellow brown, right? They cut the drums out. It's like, oh, this
Mhm.
is so refreshing, right?
Right.
It's this atmospheric feel. His voice can cut through.
There is no time to spend, concerned that this is just a trend. To lay the blame everywhere when it's yours that is the lion's share of you won't do. 'Cause we know there's nothing they will do about
Idiot Stare has a little more space in the riff. It has this different big dramatic energy to it. So when they can shake up the rhythm, the tempo, increase it, pull something out, makes a huge difference for keeping my interest. When they go through spans where they don't do that, it starts to feel like the same.
Yeah. And there's not that these songs are bad, but like track 7, 8, 9, there's like a 3 song run there. I guess you could even include Tongue Tied in there. All like 3.5 minutes.
Yeah.
And they're all like solid songs, but they're all in sort of like the same range. And I just found myself like drifting a little bit. And then you get to Spiral, which sounds like a straight up like techno song. Like it sounds like it's
Mm-hmm.
on the Doom soundtrack or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's cool, but it's so techno in comparison to some of the other songs that sound, I don't know. You can imagine a band, I guess, playing them.
Yeah. Yeah. They sound
Like
pop.
Magazine, that chorus sounds like it's like a huge rock chorus of that
Yeah.
song,
Yeah.
whereas Spiral is not in that same
No.
direction.
It's really the one song I think on the album that doesn't follow that format.
Right.
Now, it worked for me because I'm with you that span of the record. I think Your Crusade actually works for me because it's so high energy and there's some really dramatic synth parts in there that really cut through and feel epic to me. But Right Decision, Don't Believe It, Tongue Tied, it actually helps. Spiral kind of helps shake it up and like wake me up a little bit.
Yeah.
And then I think the album ends really, really strong. So some of those curveballs like Yellow Brown and Spiral are kind of important to shake things up and give some variety and I think work on the album, even though they're different.
Yeah. So I mentioned that this came out in 93. This in the US, like we mentioned that The Devil You Know did chart. I don't know for how long, but man, this sounds so out of step with 1993. I mean, this is the year of In Utero. This is the year of, I'm trying to think, is this the year of Pearl Jam's Vitology or Verses? One of those two.
Well,
It
to your
just
point, it probably would have worked better when did you two do Pop?
97.
Yeah, it probably would have worked better then.
Yeah, because I feel like at that point, because of the electronic movement that happened in the back half of the 90s, it seemed like that stuff sort of permeated the mainstream a lot easier.
Yeah.
And this probably would have done better then. And I don't think that they followed it up with quite as an electronic album. Like everything that I read, that this is their most electronic album. So they dialed it back a little bit, maybe because it wasn't as successful as the previous album. But again, you had a very big single off that. So
Yeah. It's a little distorted.
right. All right. So overall ratings on this record, Jay, worthy album, better EP, or decent single? Where do you land?
I'm going to go with a worthy album. There are some spots I fade. It's pretty, 45 minutes. I don't know that cutting it gets you anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple tunes on here I could see being mixed differently, or some instruments pulled out or simplified. But for the most part, I think it's really ambitious. I think it's a very interesting listen in 2024. It makes more sense to me now than it probably did at the time, and maybe some other people would agree with that. And it just sounds unique, I don't know that there's a lot of other albums that sound like this. There's a lot of other, rock bands that use electronic elements. Obviously, we just talked about Metric from 2009. It's one of our bonus episodes. They do it a very different way than this band's doing it.
Yeah.
And the way that this band is putting the pieces together, it just sounds very unique. And it's worth checking out. It's a worthy album for me. Where'd you land?
I'm with you. I think it's a worthy album. I think it's very unique and interesting. The fade that I have on the back half with those couple of songs, I don't think that makes it an EP. I think that there's a lot of really cool and interesting things happening on this record that I just was not prepared for. And like you said, with the Metric record, like listening to that to me is like a synth pop. Like I get that you're layering a synth on top of stuff. This is a whole different other thing.
Yeah.
And I think people should check it out, because we both clearly did not know that this existed up until now. So it's a really interesting record. So we need to thank, who did this? Who brought this to us? It was Darren Leach. He was the man who brought the Forgotten Third album by Jesus Jones. Thank you, Darren. And if you'd like to be like Darren, you can go over to digmeoutpodcast.com and drop an album suggestion at our website, both for the 90s rock podcast, which we're doing right this moment, and then the 80s metal podcast, which comes out every other week. Also want to mention that you should join us at Patreon by going to dmounion.com or digmeoutunion.com. And then you get to vote in the polls like this one that picks the albums for our episodes. And you get, depending on what tier you're at, you can get access to pick your own record once a year. We've got merch. We've got a private Discord where we discuss things. Today I learned that the number one Australian single for Kiss was Shandy, which is horrifying.
And I learned that apparently many children were named after that song.
I guess it's better than Khaleesi.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I told Gavin, who I was chatting with this, he said that they got that version of Kiss, not the Detroit version of Kiss, which is the one he wanted. And I said I felt very bad for him.
Apologies to everyone over there. So that's the kind of chatter we have going on over at the Discord. You can also go to our Substack, sign up for the Box newsletter, which comes out every week. As mentioned, it has new releases, like you would have known about the new Jesus Jones single that came out recently, and other releases from the 80s, 90s, and aughts relevant to this podcast, albums, documentaries, books, etc. And lastly, Apple Podcasts is where you go to leave positive feedback for the show. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.